I would say that in recent years, there has been an absolute explosion of concern about what we eat, but also real horror and anger at the food system, a system that causes ecological destruction, malnutrition, hunger, poverty, and serves us up unhealthy food. I think food has become very politicised. And I think actually I came and spoke about food about a year ago in Norwich via Zoom when the pandemic first happened. And that was just whilst we were in the process of writing this pamphlet that came out. And partly it was because it feels that a lot of the debates are often very moralistic about food. It's quite an emotive subject, but often personalised and presented that, you know, if we're not making the right choices, somehow it's our fault. And I think the starting point for us is that socialists want everyone to make the best choices possible, but recognise that choice isn't in a vacuum. It's actually shaped by the wider society that we live in. It can't be abstracted from capitalism. And like I say, that's what I set out to explore in the pamphlet, which this talk is based on, really. And the starting point again here then is that food is a commodity under capitalism, something to be bought and sold like everything else. So the growing and the making and the processing and selling of food is very big business. The global food system in 2018 was valued at some $10 trillion. And the bottom line here is profit, regardless of the impact on health, the environment, workers or animals. We probably predict that's not going to end that well. But I think one of the central things here is that it's often claimed that, you know, if you have an unhealthy diet or it's environmentally destructive, it's due to consumer demand. We've demanded it. And therefore the solution is to persuade people to change what they eat. I think that gets it the wrong way round. I think instead we have to look at how food is produced under capitalism, in particular the rise of industrialised agriculture and livestock production in the post-war period, and then how that food system shapes and changed our diets and therefore our choices. Because what we eat actually changed a lot in the post-war period. This is when we see, as I say, the rise of industrialised agriculture and food production. This is when processed food is first brought to us, invented in the 1950s in America, with the ready meal in particular, invented then in terms of using up leftover turkey. We got our first chilled ready meal in 1979. But it's also in the post-war period where we see a rise in people eating away from home. I think I always find it hard to believe, actually, McDonald's only had one restaurant in the entire world in 1948. And now it has over 37,000 restaurants, serving 70 million people a day pre-pandemic. And how we buy our food has changed dramatically too. You know, the first Walmart didn't even open until 1962 in the US. And now most of our grocery spend is in a supermarket of some kind. And I think you begin to see just from those examples what big business food is. Fast food giants, McDonald's and KFC, supermarkets like Asda, Walmart and Tesco. And then behind them, the massive food processing companies that supply them. And behind them, agribusiness, which I'll come to more. All of these operating on a global scale. All of them driven forward by the vast profits that you can make by what they call in the food industry, adding value to food. Essentially, making profits by doing something to simple food. Take those cheap ingredients, process them, sell them for more than the sum of their parts. Now, of course, that's obvious when it comes to ready meals and fast food. But I guess what I try and explore in the pamphlets in the section is actually just how much of our food is produced on an industrial level. You know, food manufacturing plants resemble car plants and oil refineries, not some scaled up domestic kitchen as they'd like us to believe. And how all that processing actually destroys the flavour. It has to be added back in. So there's a whole flavourings industry that goes on. How actually lots of the foodstuffs even used have been chemically altered, aren't really recognisable as what we would think as foods. You know, for example, ultra processed cheese made from milk powder and additives, instant noodles, often not real noodles actually, but oil, starch and additives. And all this used very cynically, actually, additives, flavourings to create what they call bliss points. The point really where actually will override our natural feeling of being full and carry on eating. This is what they want us to do. And lots of the food as well, though, is that, you know, actually we're looking for things that are, you know, you might not think of being processed. None of our food is off limits. Whether it's smoothies, yogurt, bread, as I say, cheese, fruit juice, processed in some way, even things that appear in their unaltered state. You know, the carrots and potatoes that get scrubbed in giant washing machines, so they appear on the shelves wet and glistening like they've just been picked. So the question is, why did these changes come about? And there is a revolution in food processing in the post-war period. Technological changes make it possible to produce processed foods. They introduce mass production techniques. I think it's always worth saying as well, this is also the time when there's changes in the workforce, working hours and family life. And I would always say that, you know, long working hours do make ready meals and processed food and fast food a necessity for many people. Actually, I don't think it's a surprise that the countries that eat the most of these are the places with the longest working hours. In the West, that is the US and Britain. But I'm going to talk about the post-war period a bit more, but I do think it's important to say that there was never, though, a golden age of good capitalist food production. And in this pamphlet, I also have a section of what Marx had to say about food production. Now, that might be a bit surprising about what did Marx say. It's not one text, but he integrated it into lots of his writings. He looked at how the Industrial Revolution itself severed the direct connection people had with the growing of food when they were ripped from their lands through the Acts of Enclosure, forced into the new towns and cities to find work. So no longer directly growing crops and rearing animals. This has big implications for agriculture in itself. And he also looked at how capitalism turned food into a commodity to be bought and sold on the market, and how actually questions of food degradation and additives and toxins was something very big in Marx's day, actually, as factory owners and food manufacturers adulterated food to try and make more money, you know, things like adding chalk to sugar, lead to tea, even worse. I think I came across a quote that I use in the pamphlet, if I can find it here, where Marx discusses the bread that people were forced to eat, and said that he probably didn't realise, the worker, that in his bread was a certain quantity of human perspiration mixed with the discharge of abscesses, cobwebs, dead cockroaches, putrid German yeast, not to mention alum, sand, and other agreeable mineral ingredients. Also, Marx making the point that this is the bread served to poor people. This wasn't the bread the rich had to eat, the class element from the beginning. And I think it's quite interesting that, you know, I've just mentioned additives and flavourings now. Food alteration does still continue as a way to make money in a new form, really. And that's through the logic of competition and the drive for profit. I also don't really have time to go into it, but I also look into the pamphlet as well, how the food systems we have today are also a legacy of slavery and colonialism that have shaped many of those elements. But there is then a big change in the post-war period, big implications for processed food. This is when farmers are encouraged to grow corn and soya and wheat and rice, which are the key grains that are at the heart of nearly all the processed foods that we know today. So farmers were offered subsidies, direct payments and loans. This is particularly in the United States, which leads to the overproduction of these key ingredients for processed foods. This is then what changes what's profitable to grow, and then changes in what we eat. Corn, for example, big recipient of US government subsidies, explosion of production in the 1970s. This is when high fructose corn syrup is invented, HFCS, you might have heard of it. Much sweeter, but also cheaper than sugar. And it meant production costs of fizzy drinks could be slashed, but it's used in everything. It prolongs shelf life, it can make goods look natural, even though they're not with it in. And it's in a whole array of products that are very, very bad for us. These subsidies then, as well for these grains, also mean it becomes very profitable to grow grain for cattle feed. A big drive from the 1950s onwards to get Americans to eat more beef. Again, just worth noting here, the role of advertising. We can explore it more if people want to, but this is a big part of the food industry, to market foods at us, very psychological. Foods aimed at babies and toddlers, actually, to try and wean their taste buds into a liking for the tastes that are more salty and sweet and fatty in processed foods, and very psychological, the toys and things like the Happy Meal aimed at children. So they'll pester their kids to go to McDonald's, and when you're an adult, you'll go back because you've got happy memories. And it also fuels more production, for example, of chicken as well. They began to be fed on soy and corn bean. Mass production techniques mean the flock sizes absolutely grow. Far more chicken is then produced than what people would normally eat. And so again, you know, the industry repackages chicken into a whole new array of products: chicken nuggets, chicken strips, chicken popcorn, chicken bombs, you probably name it, you know, how chicken is now used. And the surpluses wasn't just about more meat production. Processed cereal is another massive growth area where they use this cheap corn and wheat to produce what is in effect a completely nutritionally debased product. All the processing destroys any goodness in those grains, but it's often marketed as the healthy choice and even sponsors sports programs and all sorts, particularly in the US. So we see then industrialized food production and then industrialized agriculture beginning in the post-war period, producing these grains. And I think when we look at agriculture under capitalism in this period, actually we should be clear that the big companies that dominate, they don't do a lot of the farming themselves. Agribusiness really is what this should be called. They make money from the business of farming, selling the inputs like seeds and fertilizer and pesticide to farmers, storing, transporting and trading grain, and then processing the raw materials into foods and other products. Now, in the pamphlet, I go through the example of a company called Cargill. Now, maybe I might have mentioned it at my meeting last year. Maybe if you've read my pamphlet, you might have heard of it. This is where I usually go for some audience participation to see who has actually heard of Cargill. I'll have a little spin through. I thought Wendy would do. I knew that would be the case. Most people have got their cameras off. But what I usually find, I can't really see you all at once, but full marks, comrades, if you've heard. But what I often find is that most people haven't heard of Cargill. And that's not a surprise. They're very behind the scenes, but it is a surprise because it's one of the world's largest private corporations. Its sales in 2020 were $115 billion. It's at the heart of producing just about all the essentials for processed foods, employing 150,000 people in 70 different countries. You know, it trades everything: cotton, animal feed, meat, cocoa, salt, soya, you name it, probably Cargill's doing it. All of the eggs in McDonald's in the US pass through Cargill. It's got a fleet of ships, 500 of them, something, to transfer its product around the globe. And the point I'm really making is that they got big because of these policies of the US. The subsidies meant that corn and wheat could be produced below the cost of production. Then they go and capture the markets of other countries. Helped again by US negotiators at the World Bank or the IMF, World Trade Organization, forcing countries, particularly in the global south, to open their markets to agricultural exports. And basically when that happens, go in, dump grain, outcompete the local farmers. So this is really the process of what's being rolled out. And I think that one of the features of recent years is being worrying about food and its impact on us, but also the impact on the environment as well. And, you know, actually we can see how this global food production and modern agriculture are actually very destructive to the environment in lots of ways, in terms of fueling tropical deforestation, destroying wildlife, polluting rivers, the whole of modern industrialized agriculture reliant on the use of fossil fuels, whether that's fertilizers, pesticides, plastic packaging, transportation. And, you know, I think we're probably all grown familiar with the fact that agriculture under capitalism is characterized by monocultures, one crop repeatedly grown, usually in vast quantities, you know, allows for mass standardization, but very bad for soil, strips it of its nutrients. Also characterized by the use of hybrid seeds and now genetically modified seeds. These are in contrast to the traditionally pollinated varieties where, you know, farmers would save the seeds from the best crop, replant the next year. You can't replant hybrid seeds. Very good for those agribusiness companies I'm mentioning, because farmers have to keep buying new seed every year. But it also leads to even more use of pesticides and fertilizers, because the hybrids are bred to respond to them. And that's led to the impact on species extinction and biodiversity. And of course, we know another feature of industrialized agriculture is rearing animals in vast feedlots and warehouses, only made possible through a massive use of antibiotics, now impacting on our resistance further. And again, in the pamphlet, I do draw on the work of somebody called Timothy Wise. It's worth reading his book, Eating Tomorrow. He goes to a lot of different sorts of farmers all over the world, actually, very interesting. One of the places he goes to is Iowa, in the American Midwest, the heart of the US Corn Belt. Absolutely, well, a stark vision of agriculture under capitalism, actually. A landscape dominated by corn and soya, very few people. The small family farms have been driven out by the big holdings. All of that corn and soy are genetically modified. Massive use of what was then Monsanto's Roundup, because the crops were engineered to survive extensive spraying, marketed actually as being Roundup ready. And lots of that corn and soya grown in Iowa not even being used to feed people, because as we know, a large part of capitalist agriculture is using crops to feed animals, but also for biofuels. So in Iowa, there's something like 8,000 pig farms, 20 million pigs at any one time, 40 ethanol refineries there. Massive problems, massive soil erosion there in Iowa, all that increased animal manure together with over application of fertilizer runoff into the river, caused massive pollution to the water supply. They've had to build the biggest water treatment plant in the world to try and protect their drinking water, and flowed off down to the Gulf of Mexico, where they've created an 8,000 square mile dead zone where all the sea life is essentially suffocated and dies. So I would say that if you looked at that, you think that is not really what you'd want to roll out around the world. But this is exactly what agribusiness is in the process of and continues to roll out. Some of it, as I say, through the treaties and through the international organisations. This was actually the NAFTA Treaty of 1994 that forced really Mexico to open its markets to that corn from Iowa. This is particularly terrible. Mexico is the centre of origin for maize. The ancient Mayan people domesticated maize, something like 22,000 varieties. Yet the country was opened up through that treaty to have to import it more from America, the yellow stuff from Iowa, which actually led to a massive change in the foods that were produced, more processed foods, which actually led to a massive rise in obesity in the country. Or if it's not through the so-called official channels of the institutions, international institutions like the IMF or whatever it is, it's through land grabs, Malawi, Mozambique, other places. And I think you can see from this picture as well, this is part of what's led us to the current COVID crisis we're in, where in itself, just holding like animals and factory farming, and that is a place where virus can spread very easily. Animals are not genetically diverse either. They're monocultured animals with no immune fire breaks. And that's why we've had things like swine flu, bird flu breaking out. But also in a wider sense, as agribusiness expands into more fragile lands, previously in cultivated areas, chops down forest, actually it brings us in closer contact with those reservoirs of animals where coronaviruses have lurked for many, many years, but previously been isolated. It creates the conditions for zoonosis, that transfer over of virus from animals to human populations. But I also think I make very clear in the pamphlet that when you look at this big picture of food production under capitalism, therefore it is impossible to abstract any one aspect of food production from the rest of it. Even if something is vegan or plant-based or organic, doesn't necessarily mean it's being produced sustainably. Lots of organic farming has come under the control of multinationals actually using more highly intensive methods. And as I say, just because something's plant-based doesn't mean to say it hasn't impacted on the environment. You might have read about quinoa, the new superfood, an ancient Andean staple, which has become much more produced for export. It used to be part of quite a complex animal husbandry system involving llama on the hillsides, being brought down to the bottomland pastures and monocrop in large mechanized fields, which actually has created quite difficult problems for the soil and hardship for traditional communities as well, and led to less varieties of quinoa being produced. Mexico clearing its rainforests to grow avocados. Nuts, 80% of the world's almonds are grown in very highly intensive farms in Central Valley. In California, really being grown from a cocktail of chemicals. I mean, I could go on and show this, but I guess to kind of come towards a conclusion, really the point I'm making of this is that it's these practices of capitalist agriculture that shape the foods that were produced, therefore shaped our diets, and they've impacted on the environment. And therefore, what we eat is not just about this personal choice, it's a consequence of how agriculture is organised under capitalism, and at its heart, that overproduction of those basic grains like corn, wheat and soya. And so if we're saying that foods that's unhealthy and destructive to the environment is not just because we choose it, but because of how capitalism is organised, I don't think the solution to the problems we encounter are just individual dietary changes. I think they're actually about a much bigger radical transformation of the entire food system. And last year when I did this meeting, I was researching for the pamphlet, I did the meeting in a few places, maybe even been in Norwich, where someone said to me, it's all a bit depressing, Amy. What can we eat? What can we do? And this is where I want to finish, because I actually think there's another side to it, because there are massive battles over food, over agriculture, over food production. You think about the mass peasant movements that resist the land grabs, the resistance in Mexico that took place to GM maize, peasants and farmers fighting for the rights to save seeds. Think about, it was the food price rises that in part triggered the Arab Spring 10 years ago. Think about the mass resistance of the farmers in India at the moment when they joined the massive general strike just before Christmas, I think it was, and been part in a massive battle in their tens of thousands against the attempts of Modi really to end government aid to farmers and open up agriculture in India even further to the free market and agribusiness. And I think it shows us really clearly that food is a class issue, which I always think is very important. I think working class people, wherever country they live in, actually get fed rubbish food, marketed at them, and then get blamed for that. But class is also that potential source of power. And I think that's been exposed during the corona crisis in many ways, hasn't it? The essential workers, a lot of those are food production workers in the food production plants, the ones delivering to the supermarkets, the shelf stackers, the people that deliver food to our doors. And actually at times showing their collective strength when they've walked out on strike over questions of safety or other issues. And so for me really then, I think that's why our emphasis has to be on mass collective action, whether we see peasants and farmers and food production workers, whether they're in India, Mexico, America or Britain, as our allies in that struggle to actually transform the future of our planet, but also, fight for the safety of ourselves and for better food for everybody. I'll stop there. Thank you. Yes, there is a lot to come back on. Thank you, everybody. To be honest, the whole idea for the pamphlet came out of meetings that I'd done over the years and engaged with these ideas, meetings like this. And every time I do a meeting, to be honest, there's more questions to think about and more things to think, oh, that would have been good in the pamphlet. So this is an ongoing collaborative project, I feel. And I think I'm probably not going to answer the big question about rewilding. I think Mary put some really good points just there at the end. And actually, I just point you in a direction. There is an article in the new International Socialism Journal on rewilding. So it's probably best to read that and let's come back to that debate. But I think Mary made some really good points about that division really at the heart of the metabolic rift that's there. But look, I want to say, you see, capitalism creates problems and then it blames us. The system creates problems and it individualizes it and blames working class people, particularly so with food choices. And I think that at the start of this, we have to resist any attempts to make it about individuals, their fault and their choice and that moralism that goes with it. You see, in the discussion, people said, well, how do we let people know and how do we convince people? You see, I actually think a lot of people do know. I think a lot of people do really care about what they eat in Britain. Why is there then so many fights over the rubbish that get put in school dinners? Because people don't want their kids to eat that. Why is it that I think a lot of people are thinking about going vegetarian or vegan? I actually think there's lots of reasons. I'll come back to that in a moment. I think there's some of the difficulties people face. I think it was perhaps Keith that went through it. And this is why we have to resist all moralism, is about the questions of money and access to food and be able to get that. Very complex relationships that get built up with food. There's links actually between things, obesity and abuse and trauma and all those bigger questions and the questions of body image. Corporations make money from particularly aimed at women. So there's lots of very complex questions there. And I don't think you can, I don't think anyone is, reduce that down to individuals. And sometimes your choice is very much shaped by where you are and the circumstances. I live in East London. When I would be going out and about doing meetings, I'd come back at 12 or 1 from my train. There are 5 chicken shops open. And you can get a chicken meal for £1. And, if you come off shift, which is actually, it's very busy at that time in Barking in East London, because everyone is coming back from shifts or whatever, that's probably what you're going to eat. And from an economic level, it makes sense to get more calories per money to do that. So there's lots of big questions here, but I think people do want better diets for themselves and for their kids. And I think it's absolutely right. That's why people are thinking about what they eat in terms of a plant-based diet and whatever else. And to be honest, capitalism even co-opts that. Because look at, someone mentioned Greggs actually, but think about the Greggs Quorn sausage roll. or the vegan Subway patty. These are not produced sustainably, but they are trying to tap into people's desire to do something good and make a change by then carrying on making processed foods and making money from it. These are not produced sustainably, as I say. And look, there are lots of reasons why people might choose a vegetarian, plant-based or vegan diet. Sometimes it can be your first political act. I'll be honest, my first act was to become a vegetarian when I was 9 years old. My family weren't vegetarian. It was a political act. And then I made them all become veggie in a very annoying way, as a 9-year-old might be. But you know, this is a political act for people. And actually, just to touch on what someone said, actually, the reasons can be because of how animals are treated. It can also be about how humans are treated in the abattoirs. Keith talked about that. One of the books I read probably about 15, 20 years ago is called Fast Food Nation, where Eric Schlosser goes undercover in the fast food industry in America. And the way that workers are treated by the companies on those production lines is horrific and sustain massive injuries and no compensation at all. And actually, that has a whole also impact on the safety of the meat. The production lines speed up. Remember, they're dismantling carcasses here. You know, there's lots of problems that go on. And one of their solutions for the problems of the big corporations was to irradiate the meat. That would solve it and then feed it to us. There's lots of reasons you might choose not to eat that meat and not to eat it. The question is that a strategy for the change we want? And I think people are motivated a lot of the time by change to our environment and climate. I think we have to be clear when it comes to climate change, changing to a plant-based diet is not a strategy. In terms of carbon emissions, forestry, agriculture and food production account for 25%, a quarter of emissions. 3/4 would be left untouched. I think we're probably familiar with the statistic that 71% of emissions, I think it is since 88, come from 100 different companies. You know, we have to challenge those fossil fuel at the heart of it. And I think we have to go back then to that idea of the power of the collective. Like I say, lots of people want different and better food and often end up fighting collectively for those individual choices and whatever. But that power to challenge those vested interests at the heart that are feeding us that food. And I think people pointed to those examples. We see it at every level, really. And you see the potential power workers have in food production workers. Do you remember the Hovis strike that went on in Wigan a few years ago? And there was a crumpets crisis. There wasn't any crumpets being sent around the country. There was a strike threatened at the biggest hummus making factory in Europe in West London. It would be very worrying for hummus supplies. You can see that potential power that workers have collectively. And I think it was right, I think it was Kevin who talked about that potential for us to be, you know, an objective reality of unity with all those food production workers and farmers across the world. Now, that brings us to the question that people touched on, which is, it is true, the statistic I put in my pamphlet, that 70% of the world's food, is still produced on small family farms on only 25% of the world's arable land. So that's quite a lot. That's exactly what agribusiness want to expand into. And I think Pete is right when he says part of that is trying to connect those local family farms with those markets, but it's also to go in and sell them the seeds and the fertilizer and the pesticide, and then perhaps change what they grow to be the key ingredients to be the processed foods. And then you introduce the processed foods. The process that I described happening in Mexico was exactly that. This is what they want to get their hands on. And there is resistance to that. That's like part of what we're saying in India and other places. We don't always hear about the resistance, actually. That isn't a separate fight, actually, from a lot of the collective workers' struggles. If you're in the global south, you may have a farming land as a peasant or farmer or whatever, a small holding still. Probably your family members are also working in the cities to bring in money, or you might work sometimes in that bigger economy. There is a connection, there is a growing global working class, but also is linked often to people on the land. And I think that is a potential power. But you see, it's also then about what would agriculture and food look like in a different country. You see, to me, a lot of these agribusiness, you have a very colonial mindset to justify why they're going to go into the global south. These poor peasants, you know, they need our help and expertise to farm, otherwise everyone's going to starve. Well, by the way, first of all, 1.5 times as many calories as are needed are produced already in the world. So enough food is produced to give everyone 1.5 times the food they need. It's about distribution. but also peasants have immense knowledge of their soil, of their climate, of farming practices built up over many generations. I would see a vision of, how would that knowledge be valued in a different society, but also to relieve peasants of the backbreaking work of whatever it is, 12 hours a day. And that would require a join up with some of the, technological changes, but not imposed, but under our control. And that's the point. We need control. We need control of the land. We need control of that tech. We need control of the food system. That means wresting it off those people at the top who seek to make money from the very thing we need to survive, our food and even our water. And that means mass collective action. It means fighting at every stage for better food in the here and now, better conditions in the food workplace, to stop the expansion of practices that are unsustainable. But it ultimately means getting rid of that whole system. And that's about capitalism. It means breaking the profit motive. And that's about mass collective action of the people that we're talking globally coming together to challenge. And that's the sort of vision we have for a different world. And you're right, it's a big challenge. Can we do it? I think more people want to. If you think about the climate strikes, over that week in September 2019, 7 million people globally were on protests. That's something. How do we reinvigorate that? And I think there's a desire. If you think about the COVID crisis, let's not go back to normal. Normal was a crisis. Normal failed us. We have to think how we link up the fights in the here and now. And we've got a big opportunity with the COP26 coming to Glasgow, probably in the autumn, with other fights as we resist the Tories' onslaught to make us pay for that crisis. And I think if you agree with the sort of analysis we're putting forward today, and agree with that different vision of how society could be differently under our control in a democratic way, where people's skills are valued, then join us, because we have a big challenge, but we have to fight collectively together. Join us in the SWP if you've agreed and like this meeting. That's where I'll finish.